She wasn't supposed to say anything. Every nanny before her had learned this fast. You arrive, you smile, you keep your eyes below the sightline of men in dark suits stationed at the end of every hallway. You care for the child. You do not notice the conversations that stop when you enter rooms. You do not ask about the fountain that hasn't run in 3 years or the painting-shaped shadow above the mantel where something was removed and never replaced. You keep your mouth shut, and when the quiet of that little girl finds a way through your ribs and sits there like something living, you leave. Quickly, without explanation. Like the 3 who came before, the agency coordinator had delivered all of this over lukewarm barley tea at a table in Hongdae, speaking in the careful half-sentences of someone who had signed too many NDAs to say anything useful. The household has expectations. The child is sensitive. The environment can be challenging. Imani Celeste Brooks had nodded, signed the contract, and slid it back across the table before the coordinator finished her tea. She had come to Seoul for answers, not comfort. If challenging was what this city offered, she'd take it in both hands. What no amount of careful preparation had accounted for, not the research, not the files, not the 2 years of building a picture of a man she had never met, was the parking lot. It was a Tuesday, 3 days into the job. The private school in Mapogu was releasing into the late afternoon, the way expensive schools do, unhurried, cushioned by privilege so established it no longer needed to announce itself. Black sedans idling at angles, drivers holding doors with practiced invisibility, mothers in structured wool-checking phones with the particular boredom of women who had arranged their lives to never need to rush. Imani stood near the gate holding Ariam's backpack, pale pink, an embroidered rabbit on the front pocket, one ear slightly flattened from being gripped too many times. Ariam stood close, her shoulder against Imani's hip, watching the other children with something that wasn't quite longing and wasn't quite resignation, but lived in the narrow country between the two. Nobody waved at her. She didn't wave at anyone. Imani had noticed this on day 1. Ariam existed at the margin of every space she entered, present enough to register, removed enough to never be reached. The other children had adapted to her silence the way children adapt to anything that doesn't offer what they want. Efficiently. Without cruelty they'd remember or warmth they'd regret. The black SUV arrived too fast and parked at an angle that said I have never once been told to move my car, and Shin Yi-won stepped out. And the first thing Imani registered, the first unavoidable, sharply inconvenient thing, was that he was more beautiful in person than anything she had prepared herself for. Long black hair, loose today and stirred by wind coming off the Han River 2 streets west. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, the kind of face constructed to be looked at and that had never forgiven anyone for looking. Charcoal coat, no tie, moving through the crowd with the total ease of a man who had spent 20 years never needing to announce himself, because every room had already decided before he arrived that he was the most dangerous thing in it. Ariam's hand found Imani's wrist, not grabbing, just touching. The way you touch a railing in the dark, not because you plan to fall, but because the ground feels uncertain and you need to know something solid is there. He spotted his daughter. A flicker crossed his face, contained before it could become visible, and his expression reset into its default, remote, unreadable, the emotional architecture of a locked building. Ariam. His voice was low. The child flinched. Not dramatically, barely anything, the smallest possible condensing of herself, like a candle flame pulling inward when someone opens a window nearby. Imani felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He crouched to his daughter's level, which was effort, which mattered, but his jaw was tight and his eyes were doing what Imani had already cataloged in 72 hours of observation. Scanning, assessing, finding everywhere to look except directly at the child in front of him, because directly required something he no longer knew how to produce. "Did you eat lunch?" Ariam nodded. "Did you speak to your teacher?" The smallest shake of her head. What moved through his face wasn't anger. It was frustration that had been living inside anger's house long enough to start dressing like it. "Ariam, we've been over this. Every week your teacher sends the same report. You sit in the back. You don't participate. You yell at your daughter one more time," Imani said, "and you will regret it." The parking lot kept moving around them, cars, children, the mundane machinery of an expensive afternoon. But in the specific air between Imani and Shin Yi-won, everything contracted into a single point. The 2 men who had followed him from the SUV moved. One step each, shoulders squaring, the rehearsed choreography of people trained for exactly this geometry. He didn't look at them. His eyes stayed on Amani, and she held it, the full specific weight of that attention, which was different from being looked at by ordinary people. Being looked at by Yiwon felt like being read at speed by someone who had never once been wrong about what they found. She did not blink. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think you heard me. Same temperature, same weight." She didn't speak to her teacher because she's frightened, not defiant, frightened. There's a significant gap between those two things, Mr. Shin, and standing in a school parking lot interrogating a 6-year-old about her performance tells me nobody's pointed that gap out to you yet. "You've been in my household for 3 days. Been watching your daughter for 3 days," she said. "Same thing." Younger man behind him stepped forward. Yiwon raised one hand without looking back, and the man stopped like a sentence cut mid-word. He kept looking at her. Long enough that a woman pushing a stroller gave their cluster a wide berth and walked faster without appearing to know why. Then something happened that none of them expected. He went quiet, not the quiet of restraint, not the braced stillness of someone swallowing a response. Something deeper, structural. A man who has just felt the ground shift beneath him and is very carefully not looking down. He turned to Ariam, and in his face, briefly, so briefly it almost wasn't visible, something cracked. Not dramatically. A hairline fracture. The kind that doesn't announce itself until much later, when the whole wall comes down. He held out his hand. Ariam looked up at Amani first. That checking glance, fast, automatic, the ingrained reflex of a child who has learned to read every room before moving through it. Amani gave the smallest nod. Ariam reached up and took her father's hand. Yiwon walked his daughter toward the car without another word, and the younger man lingered near Amani with the expression of someone whose threat assessment had just returned inconclusive results. "MS. Brooks, you'll be riding with us." She picked up the pink backpack with the flattened rabbit ear and followed. If you're already feeling something you didn't expect, hold on to it. Because that parking lot was only the first thing that broke open. Stay with this. The Shin estate sat behind walls in a neighborhood where the walls themselves were the statement, cream-colored, high, threaded with ivy cultivated to look effortless. Inside the gate, a driveway with motion-sensitive lighting that activated at dusk, a stone fountain that hadn't run in 3 years, and a house designed to communicate power that was currently communicating something more complicated and harder to name. Yeonjai was everywhere in the shape of her absence. The space above the mantel where a painting had been taken down. The garden bench with no cushion. The kitchen refrigerator bearing a laminated list in neat handwriting, held by a persimmon-shaped magnet, meal preferences, tiny specific notes, in the handwriting of someone who had understood that knowing what a person wants at 7 a.m. is its own form of love. Amani had found the list on her first morning and stood reading it longer than she should have. Ariam likes her rice slightly undercooked. Yiwon doesn't eat fish on Mondays. His mother used to make it then, and the smell takes him somewhere he doesn't want to go. She memorized both. Mentioned neither. That first evening she made Ariam's rice the way the list said, slightly underdone, the grains holding their individual shape, and set the bowl in front of her, and watched the child take one bite and look up with an expression so enormous and undefended that Amani had to find something to do with her hands. She turned and wiped down the counter, slowly, so the moment could exist without being examined, dinner without Yiwon. He was in the East Wing study behind a closed door, through which came low voices, the occasional hard placement of something on a hard surface, the tonal texture of a conversation that was actually a negotiation and had been for some time. At 8:47 p.m. Kwon Do-yeon came down from the study, and Amani, returning from settling Ariam, nearly walked into him at the top of the stairs, mid-30s. Lean, with a face built on lines that were easier to trust than they probably deserved, the kind of face that had learned at some point that being likable was a professional asset worth cultivating. He smiled when he saw her. Genuinely, which was unusual enough in this household to register. "MS. Brooks, I heard about this afternoon. Already. Small world," he said, meaning the household, probably meaning something that encompassed considerably more geography. He glanced toward the study. "He's not angry. I didn't think he was." That landed somewhere unexpected. "Most people assume." He went quiet, she said. "Angry people get loud." He went quiet. "That's a different calculation entirely." She shifted the folded blanket in her arms. "What does quiet mean for him?" Do-yeon looked at her with an expression.